Chapter 5 of The Power of Israel in the United States by James Petras. The Spy Trial. A political bombshell. What country has hundreds of spies, moles, and collaborators working for a foreign government in the US for over 30 years with impunity? According to former and present knowledgeable news reporters, some recently interviewed by the FBI, federal agents point to the Israeli secret police, Mossad, as the organizer and promoter of the espionage network within the US. In one of its biggest spy investigations ever, over 100 FBI agents from city offices throughout the country interviewed thousands of potential witnesses, informants, and suspects in connection with Israeli espionage in the United States. One former news reporter for an influential British weekly told me that he was interviewed twice over 12 hours about mass media collaboration with the Mossad in transmitting disinformation and pro-Israel propaganda as news. From conversations with journalists interviewed by the FBI, a picture emerges of a large-scale, deep penetration of American society and its government by Israeli spies and their collaborators. According to my sources, the FBI has been investigating Israeli espionage networks for over 30 years. The spy investigation has been hampered by politicians of both parties, in the pay of Israeli lobbies and wealthy pro-Israel campaign funders. Even the FBI has been infiltrated, according to a writer for the British Economist. Testimony filed by the writer in the early 1980s implicating Richard Pearl and Paul Wolfowitz and handing over documents to Mossad agents was removed from FBI files and disappeared. Over the years, the Israeli secret services have become ever more brazen and crude in their operations in the U.S. The scope includes hundreds of Israelis, Israeli Americans, dual citizens, and their local collaborators, Sayanim, or volunteer Jewish supporters of Israeli agents outside Israel. In the aftermath of 9/11, hundreds of Israeli agents who were canvassing government offices were rounded up and quietly deported. Quietly, not because they were not committing serious crimes, but in order to avoid arousing political attacks from the major pro-Israel organizations and their congressional clients. The mass expulsion of Israeli spies was a response to Israel's failure to cooperate in preventing the massacre of thousands of people in New York on September 11, 2001. The FBI appeared to have proof that Israeli intelligence had detailed evidence of the 9/11 terror attack and failed to provide the information to U.S. authorities. My sources go on to state that Israelis relayed information just prior to the attack that threw the FBI off the track. While the Mossad has the biggest spy network and the most powerful support system of any country operating in the U.S., what is of special interest is that these operations penetrate the highest spheres of the U.S. government, including the office of Vice President Cheney, according to FBI investigators. The prolonged investigation and the recent massive allocation of resources and agents to the Israeli connection was precisely due to the spiny issue of dealing with suspects in the highest spheres of government. According to one Philadelphia-based Fed, one wrong step could lead to the higher-ups quashing the investigation. So the investigators extended interviews, covering all possible sources, accumulating thousands of pages of transcripts, affidavits, wiretaps, videos of anyone and everyone knowledgeable or potentially implicated in Israel's long-standing espionage operations. Despite the intensified investigations, scores of Israeli agents and recent recruits continued their operations, many receiving protective cover from the philo-Zionist Christian evangelicals, as well as the Sayanim. A key target of the FBI investigations, but one very difficult to crack, was the AL, a secret unit of experienced Kachas, Mossad case officers who recruit enemy agents as described by former Mossad agent Viktor Ostrovsky in By Way of Deception. According to my newspaper sources, passing Israeli disinformation as instanced by the case of Judith Miller was common practice throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Many of the top journalists and editorial writers knowingly accepted and published or broadcast Israeli disinformation disseminated by Mossad agents acting as political officers in the Israeli embassy. A recent example In May 2006, AIPAC and the Senator for Tel Aviv, Charles Schumer, spread the malicious rumor that the Iranian parliament had passed a law that would require Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians to wear colored badges to identify themselves as non-Muslims. This brazen falsehood was parroted predictably by the State Department, which said it instanced, quote, clear echoes of Germany under Hitler. No such law had passed. In fact, Iranian lawmakers, including a Jewish member of parliament, said there had been no such discussion. The FBI investigations of Israel's extensive espionage operations in the U.S. stemmed from several factors. After years of close collaboration between Israeli intelligence and the FBI, the latter, along with the CIA, took the blame for the 9/11 intelligence failure, without any mention of the lack of Israel's cooperation and in the face of its disinformation. Secondly, the brazen large-scale invasion of Israeli operatives on FBI turf in the U.S. undermined the agency's own activities, eroded its position as a security agency, and particularly challenged its counter-espionage operations. Thirdly, the ascendancy of Wolfowitz, Feith, and Pearl to the top echelons of the Pentagon, and Elliott Abrams, Rubin, and Libby to the National Security Council, State Department, and the Office of the Vice President led to the massive and ready transfer of confidential documents and sensitive decisions to the army of Mossad operatives and Israeli high military intelligence officers, both here and in Israel. The flow of information from the U.S. to Israel became an unchecked torrent, and worst of all, as far as it was concerned, the FBI was rendered organizationally marginal, if not scorned. What was particularly galling to the FBI was that they had at least 5 witnesses willing to testify against Wolfowitz and Feith in an earlier spying incident who, because of their high positions and presidential backing, especially after 9/11, could not be touched. The FBI was certainly aware of the deep penetration of the U.S. state and the key role which Israel played in advising, directing, and passing propaganda and directives to their agents, collaborators, and the major Zionist organizations in the run-up to the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Given the war hysteria and the anti-terrorist propaganda pumped out by the entire pro-Israel ideological apparatus, the Israeli supporters in the government operated openly and with impunity, defying both the FBI and the CIA by setting up their own Office of Special Plans as the key intelligence operation to transmit Israeli disinformation directly to the White House. The onset and immediate aftermath of the Iraqi war and the subsequent occupation marked a high point of Israeli tyranny over Washington. Pro-Israel advisors, cabinet members, ideologues, spokesmen or women, AIPACers, and their allies in the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations, CPMJO, celebrated their success in pushing the U.S. to utterly destroy Israel's principal adversary, Iraq, its army, economy, administrative and educational systems, and infrastructure. The celebration and victory of Israel over U.S. good sense and national interest was short-lived. As the Iraqi resistance gained force, as U.S. casualties mounted and war costs ballooned, the American public turned against the war and support for the Bush administration fell precipitously. With these political changes, the Israeli agents and collaborators in the government, authors and architects of the war, lost some of their immunity from investigation. The FBI, sensing the favorable change in the political climate, vastly expanded their investigation. Interrogations followed, including Feith, Wolfowitz, Pearl, and other Zion cons, closely identified with Israeli intelligence. Fearful of attacks from unconditional supporters of Israel in the United States Congress and Executive, Senator Clinton and Lieberman, Secretary of State Condi Rice, and Vice President Cheney, the ever-cautious agency focused on the offenses of several notorious pro-Israel targets. Irving Scooter Libby of the Vice President's Office for revealing the identity of an undercover CIA agent, Larry Franklin, a second-level Pentagon official linked to Feith and Wolfowitz for spying for Israel, and 2 leaders of the major pro-Israel lobby, AIPAC, American Israel Political Action Committee, Rosen and Weissman for passing confidential documents to Mossad agents in the Israeli embassy and to knowing journalists in the Washington Press Corps. As the FBI investigation of the Israeli connection proceeded to reach higher in the state hierarchy, Wolfowitz, whose lifelong ambition was to be number one in the Defense Department, suddenly resigned and was appointed to head the World Bank. Feith also resigned and rejoined his U.S.-Israeli law firm as the investigation touched on one of his major conduits for supplying Israeli intelligence, Franklin. AIPAC on trial. In August 2004, the FBI and the U.S. Justice Department Counterintelligence Bureau announced that they were investigating a top Pentagon analyst suspected of spying for Israel and handing over highly confidential documents on U.S. policy toward Iran to AIPAC, which in turn handed them over to the Israeli embassy. The FBI had been covertly investigating senior Pentagon analyst Larry Franklin and AIPAC leaders Stephen Rosen and Keith Weissman for several years prior to their indictment for spying. On August 29, 2005, the Israeli embassy predictably hotly denied the spy allegation. On the same day, Larry Franklin was publicly named as a spy suspect. Franklin had worked closely with Michael Ledeen and Douglas Feith in fabricating the case for war with Iraq. He was also the senior analyst on Iran, which is at the top of AIPAC's lists of targets for war. As the investigation proceeded toward formal charges of espionage, the pro-Israeli think tanks and ZionCon ideologues joined in a two-pronged response. On the one hand, some questioned whether handing over documents was a crime at all, claiming it involved routine exchanges of ideas and lobbying. On the other hand, Israeli officials and media denied any Israeli connection with Franklin, minimizing his importance in policymaking circles, while others vouched for his integrity. The FBI investigation of the Washington spy network deepened and included the interrogation of two senior members of Feith's Office of Special Plans, William Luty and Harold Rode. The OSP was responsible for feeding bogus intelligence, leading to the U.S. attack on Iraq. The leading FBI investigator, Dave Sadi, stated that the FBI investigation involved wiretaps, undercover surveillance, and photography that documented the passing of classified information from Franklin to the men at AIPAC and on to the Israelis. The Franklin AIPAC Israeli investigation was more than a spy case. It involved the future of U.S.-Middle East relations, and more specifically, whether the ZionCons would be able to push the U.S. into a military confrontation with Iran. As a top Pentagon analyst on Iran, Franklin had access to all the executive branch deliberations on Iran. AIPAC lobbying and information gathering was aggressively directed toward pushing the Israeli agenda to a U.S.-Iranian confrontation against strong opposition in the State Department, CIA, military intelligence, and field commanders. Franklin's arrest on May 4, 2005, and the subsequent arrest of AIPAC Foreign Policy Research Director Steve Rosen and Iran Specialist and Deputy Director for Foreign Policy Keith Weissman on August 4, 2005 was a direct blow to the Israeli AIPAC war agenda for the U.S. The FBI investigation proceeded with caution, accumulating detailed intelligence over several years. Prudence was dictated by the tremendous political influence that AIPAC and its allies among the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations wield in Congress, the media, and among fundamentalist Christians, which could be brought to bear when the accused spies were brought to trial. The first blow was struck on August 29, 2004, when CBS publicized the FBI investigation just when Franklin confessed to have passed highly confidential documents to a member of the Israeli government and began cooperating with the federal agents. He was prepared to lead authorities to his contacts inside the Israeli government. Subsequently, Franklin stopped cooperating. Abe Foxman and the Anti-Defamation League, a leading Jewish pro-Israeli lobby, called for a special prosecutor to investigate leaks of the FBI investigation because they were tarnishing Israel's image, called Magna Chutzpah. Then, Attorney General Ashcroft intervened to try to apply the brakes to the investigation. which spread into the Zion nest and the Pentagon. Feith, Wolfowitz, Pearl, and Rubin were interviewed by the FBI. Zion Michael Rubin, former Pentagon specialist on Iran and resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, blasted Bush for inaction in the spy affair and called the investigation an anti-Semitic witch hunt. AIPAC launched a massive campaign against the spy probe and in support of its activities and leaders. As a result, scores of leading Congress members from both parties vouched for AIPAC's integrity and pledged their confidence and support of AIPAC. Never in the history of the United States had so many leading Congress members from both parties pledged their support for an organization under suspicion of spying, a support based only on information supplied by the suspect and in total ignorance of the federal prosecutor's case. Contrary to the bipartisan congressional support for AIPAC, a poll of likely voters found that 61% believed that AIPAC should be asked to register as an agent of foreign power and lose its tax-exempt status. Only 12% disagreed. Among Jewish Americans, 59% were not sure, while 15% strongly agreed and 15% strongly disagreed. Clearly, many Americans have serious doubts about the loyalty and nature of AIPAC activities, contrary to the views of their elected representatives. The federal spy investigation proceeded despite executive and congressional opposition, knowing that it had the backing of the great majority of U.S. citizens. In December 2004, the FBI subpoenaed 4 senior staffers at AIPAC to appear before a grand jury and searched the Washington office of the pro-Israel lobby seeking additional files on Rosen and Weissman. AIPAC continued to deny any wrongdoing, stating, "Neither AIPAC nor any member of our staff has broken any law. We believe any court of law or grand jury will conclude that AIPAC employees have always acted legally, properly, and appropriately." Nevertheless, a few months into the investigation and with the arrest of the 2 top leaders, AIPAC was to terminate their employment and, after a few months, cut off paying their legal defense bills. Likewise, Israel's categorical denials of espionage evaporated as video and transcripts of their intelligence operative receiving classified documents surfaced. A grand jury was convoked in early 2005. As the FBI spy investigation extended into AIPAC Pentagon's inner recesses, self-confessed spy Franklin's superiors, Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith, announced their sudden resignations from the number 2 and number 3 positions in the Pentagon, most likely reflecting a deal with the Justice Department to free themselves from further investigations into their ties with Israeli intelligence and Franklin. In February 2005, Bush announced that former convicted felon, defender of Central American death squads and longtime Zionist fanatic Elliot Abrams would be in charge of Middle East policy in the National Security Council. Abrams would serve as a channel to the White House for directing Israeli policies and as day-to-day source of the most essential policy decisions and discussions. Apparently, Abrams was smart enough to keep his distance from the Franklin, Feith, and AIPAC embassy operations and deal directly with Ariel Sharon and his chief of staff, Dov Weinglass. In April 2005, AIPAC dismissed Rosen and Weissman, saying their activities did not comport with organization standards. On May 4, Franklin was arrested on charges of illegally disclosing highly classified information to 2 employees of a pro-Israel lobbying group. On June 13, 2005, an expanded indictment explicitly named AIPAC and a foreign country, Israel, and its Mossad agent, Naor Gillen, who had, in the meantime, fled to Israel. Despite AIPAC being named in a major espionage indictment involving Steve Rosen, head of its foreign policy department, and Keith Weissman, head of its Iran desk, U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice gave the keynote address at AIPAC's convention, May 22 through 24, 2005. Leaders from Congress and the Republican and Democratic parties also spoke, declaring their unconditional support for AIPAC, Israel, and Ariel Sharon. The list included Senator Hillary Clinton, Senator Majority Leader Bill Frist, and Senate Democratic Leader Harry Reid. More than half of the U.S. Senate and 1/3 of U.S. Congress members were in attendance. Clearly, AIPAC, with 60,000 wealthy members and a $60 million annual budget, had more influence on the political behavior of the U.S. executive, political parties, and elected representatives than a federal indictment implicating its leaders for espionage on behalf of Israel. Could there be a basis for charging our political leaders as accomplices after the fact of espionage if the AIPAC leaders are convicted? Or is the very notion of hard edge as opposed to blurred sovereignties separating the two countries moot? On August 4, 2005, Paul McNulty of the Justice Department formally indicted AIPAC leaders Stephen Rosen and Keith Weissman of receiving and passing highly confidential documents via the Israeli embassy to the State of Israel. Their trial was set for April 25, 2006. Franklin's trial was set to begin on April 2, 2006, but has been postponed. Franklin has been cooperating with the FBI and Justice Department in its investigations of AIPAC and the Pentagon's Israel Firsters in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq and the further plans to attack Iran. The indictments are based on a prolonged investigation. AIPAC had been targeted for investigation as early as 2001, while the indictment of Rosen and Weissman cites illegal activities beginning in April 1999. After Rosen and Weissman came under intensive federal investigations as co-conspirators in the Franklin spy case, AIPAC decided to cut its losses and cover its backside by throwing them overboard. It fired them on March 2005, arguing that their conduct was not part of the job and beneath the standards required of AIPAC employees. In effect, AIPAC was making Rosen and Weissman the fall guys in order to shake off a deeper federal probe of AIPAC's activities. Moreover, AIPAC stopped payments to Rosen and Weissman's lawyers, potentially sticking them with almost $500,000 in legal fees. AIPAC does not intend to pay the fees before the trial is over. Not for lack of funds, they raised over $60 million in 2005 and are tax exempt, but for political reasons. AIPAC wants to see how the trial goes. If they are acquitted, it will be safe to pay their lawyers. But if they are found guilty, AIPAC will refuse to pay, citing the organization's bylaw technicalities. In order to avoid being implicated with convicted spies, AIPAC leaders are putting their organizational interests and their capacity to promote Israeli interests in Congress and the media over loyalty to their former officials. Facing up to 10 years in federal prison, up against detailed, well-documented federal charges based on wiretaps, videos, and the testimony of self-confessed spy and Pentagon contact Franklin, fired and denounced by their former colleagues and current leaders of AIPAC, Rosen and Weissman are striking back with unexpected vehemence. The defense attorneys are expected to argue that receiving information from the administration officials was something the two were paid and encouraged to do and something AIPAC does routinely. In other words, Rosen and Weissman will say that pumping top U.S. government officials for confidential memos and handing them over to Israeli officials was a common practice among AIPAC operatives. To bolster their case of just following AIPAC orders, Rosen and Weissman's defense lawyers will subpoena AIPAC officials to testify in court about their past access to confidential documents, their contacts with high-placed officials, and their collaboration with Israeli embassy officials. Such testimony could likely bring national and international exposure to AIPAC's role as a two-way transmission belt to and from Israel. If Rosen and Weissman succeed in tying AIPAC to their activities, and if they are convicted, that opens up a much larger federal investigation of AIPAC's role in aiding and abetting felonious behavior on behalf of the State of Israel. In the almost 2 years since Rosen and Weissman came into the public limelight as spy suspects, AIPAC has successfully fended off adverse publicity by mobilizing leading politicians, party leaders, and senior members of the Bush administration to give public testimonials on its behalf. It successfully dumped Rosen and Weissman and pushed ahead with lining up the U.S. Congress with Israel's pro-war agenda against Iran. And then, out of the blue, Rosen and Weissman threatened to blow their cover as just another influential lobby working to promote U.S. and Israeli mutual security interests. Rosen and Weissman's defense will certainly bring out the fact that AIPAC at no point informed their employees about what the law states regarding the obtaining and handling over highly confidential information to a foreign power. Weissman and Rosman will argue that they did not know that receiving confidential information from administration officials and handing it over to Israel was illegal since everybody was doing it. They will further argue that their alleged spy activity was not a rogue operation carried on by them independently of the organization, but was known and approved by their superiors, citing AIPAC's employee procedures for reporting to superiors. This action will promote AIPAC from the secondary role of aiding and abetting to a primary role of soliciting and instigating illegal espionage against the government of the United States. Rosen and Weissman are taking on biblical stature. According to one former AIPAC employee with connections to the organization's current leadership, Rosen and Weissman are perceived as acting like Samson trying to bring the house down on everyone that is involved in exploiting U.S. wealth, power, and military forces to serve Israel's expansionist interests. What started out as a small-scale spy trial, no different from other recent cases, is growing into a major cause célèbre involving the most powerful lobby influencing the entire direction of U.S. Middle East policy. If Rosen and Weissman are convicted, and they effectively make the case that they were following orders and informing AIPAC of their felonious activities, it is possible that this will drive away many wealthy Jewish donors and activists and perhaps put some shame into politicians who kowtow and feed at the AIPAC trough. With a weakened AIPAC and its neocon, Zioncon allies in the government wary of continuing to liaison with Israeli intelligence on Middle East policy, it is possible that a free and open debate based on U.S. interests can take place. With a public debate relatively free of the constraints imposed by the Israel First lobbies and ideologues, perhaps the U.S. public's opposition to Middle East wars and occupations can become the dominant discourse in Congress, if not the executive. Perhaps some $3 billion plus of annual foreign aid to Israel can be reallocated toward rebuilding all the industrially ravaged cities and towns of Michigan, upstate New York, and elsewhere. A move from Middle East militarism to a democratic foreign policy will not happen just because of a spy trial, no matter how severe the sentence and no matter how deeply AIPAC is implicated. Unless the American public is organized as a democratic majority capable of confronting party, congressional, and executive leaders with the choice, you are either for America or for AIPAC.